Hello, everyone. Welcome to our session today. My name is Gabrielle Oates. I'm here with the Educating All Learners Alliance team. And welcome to our webinar on disproportionate discipline and COVID-19, a call for change. So to give you a little bit of information on what ELA is before I go ahead and pass it over to our speakers, ELA was developed just a few months ago in response to COVID-19. And so we have recently launched our new website, which we encourage you to check out at educatingalllearners.org. And on that site, we've created a hub of tools, strategies, resources, including events such as this one, for educators and families to use as resources, particularly focused on special education and supporting those students. We have a few founding partners included here on the screen, some of them who are speaking in today's session. And we have an ongoing list and growing list of partners. So if that's something that you would like to participate in, we'll share these slides with you all, and you can read more information there. And you can also engage on our website after this webinar. So for now, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to our speakers, but I did want to briefly introduce them. So first we have Megan Whitaker from NCLD, and she's the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the National Center for Learning Disabilities. And we also have Wendy Tucker from our team at the center, which is the National Center for Special Education in Charter Schools. And there she is the Senior Director of Policy. So if you have any questions throughout this webinar, please feel free to add them directly in the chat and we'll address them throughout. And we'll also have more dedicated times where Megan and Wendy can answer any questions that you have and concerns, and we'll share some links with you. So with that, I'll go ahead and pass it on over to our presenters.
Thank you. Thank you, Gabrielle. So we would love for you, we want this to be as interactive as possible. So please definitely go ahead and put questions in the chat, and we will pause at places if you want to do, if you want to ask questions then. We'd love for you to put in the chat like what your role is and you know what brought you to this conversation. So today's agenda, we're going to talk a little bit about the discipline crisis, which I think most of us probably are aware of. We're going to think about the discipline crisis for students with disabilities that existed before COVID, and then we're going to look at that added COVID layer on top of it, and the potential for it to be an even bigger crisis. Then we're going to look at ways that schools and families can rethink how discipline is addressed in this era. And then Megan is going to talk to you about the policy conversations that are happening, mainly at the national level, around school climate and discipline. And finally, we're going to just give you a couple key takeaways and take more questions there as we go. So first of all, the discipline crisis. Students with disabilities are routinely, and this has been the case well before COVID, for decades, suspended, expelled, subjected to restraint, subjected to seclusion or isolation, referred to law enforcement at exorbitantly higher rates than students without disabilities. It's at least double, and we're going to look at some of the data, but it's at least double their non-disabled peers. And then when you layer race on top of that, it's even more concerning. And we've noted here that that's despite legal protections, and just wanted to take a second to mention, and many of you educators know this, and parents, if you're on here, will know this as well, but students with disabilities have extra protections from harsh discipline. They have federal rights, including in the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. They have the right to determinations as to whether their behavior is a manifestation of their disability, and there are certain hoops that schools need to go through before they can do any harsh discipline in those circumstances. There's no federal law on restraint and seclusion today. And Megan will talk a little bit about that, but there are state laws that protect against restraint and seclusion. Different states have different laws, and then even districts have different policies. So we're not going to go into a detailed discussion of those protections. That's like a month-long webinar that we don't have time to do, but we thought it was important to note that those protections existed when all of the data that we're about to go through that shows the disproportionality, when, despite all those protections, the disproportionality still exists. So it's not just like on an even playing field, students with disabilities are disciplined more, it's even with added protections. So we look at out of school suspensions and expulsions, and this data is from 2015-16, the Civil Rights Data Collection, which is the most robust data set that we have for this information. And some folks may say, well, that was, a couple of years ago, surely things have improved. But if you look at sort of the trend lines on this from years back from this same data, it has not improved. And so there's not really any reason to think that from 15-16 to now, these numbers have changed much. So this is I think a pretty good data set to ground our conversation. So if you look at the I guess it's aqua. The blue-green numbers are students with disabilities. It's percentage of those students. And then the brighter blue is percentage of students without disabilities. So that first on the left is enrollment. So kids with disabilities nationally on average are about 12% of the public school population. Yet they are 26% of students who are suspended and 24% of students who are expelled. So the numbers at which they are suspended and expelled are far outweigh their percentage in the population. When you look at restraint and seclusion, the data is even more disturbing. So you again have 12% of the population overall, yet 71% of students who are reported as subject to restraint. And I think that's important to note. These are actually actual reports of restraints, that the data that's collected. 71% are kids with disabilities. Students that are secluded, which means often a closed room in not just timeout. Timeout doesn't count as seclusion, but actual seclusion. 66% of those students are students with disabilities. And so you can see the disproportionality there. When you look at referrals to law enforcement, again, 12% of the population, 28% of the referrals to law enforcement are school-related arrests. Layered on top of these numbers is an additional crisis for Black students with disabilities. And this chart is hard to read, so let me just make sure. This is basically disciplinary removals. So all the things that we just talked about, and this is 2017-18, so it's a little bit later, and it's all of those things combined. The dark brown is for all students with disabilities. And you can see that's 29% had been subjected to some form of disciplinary removal. When you disaggregate that and look at Black or African American students with disabilities, that number skyrockets to 65%. So I'm going to say that again because it's kind of a hard number to grasp. 65% of students with disabilities who are Black, African American students were removed for disciplinary reasons from their educational environment. So clearly a crisis. This is all before COVID. Obviously, a crisis exists. When you look you disaggregate a little bit further and look for Black boys. 1 in 4 Black boys with IEPs are suspended compared to 1 in 10 white boys with IEPs. And so it's an important part of this conversation to recognize that it is a crisis for students, all students with disabilities. It is an even greater crisis for students of color with disabilities. So we wanted to just highlight that data and make sure that we were all on the same page as knowing where that crisis stood. So then that's all pre-COVID. Then COVID hits, right? And students lose months of instructional time. Keeping in mind that those suspensions, expulsions, restraint, and isolation are all lost instructional time. So you have this additional COVID-related loss of instructional time where everybody's scrambling to figure out how to continue to do education with a pandemic. You add a bunch of traumas, right? I think everyone alive today has dealt with some COVID-related trauma, different levels of it, obviously. You have financial insecurity, food and housing insecurity. You've already talked about school closures, loss. A lot of folks, students, teachers, families have lost family members to COVID. And so you have this incredible amount of trauma that is layered on top. Whoops, I don't know what just happened there. Go back. And then on top of that, you add these new safety protocols, right? As schools are reopening, students will, in most schools, in most instances, be required to socially distance. They will have to wear masks. They will, recess will not look like recess looked. Lunch probably doesn't look like lunch looked. Often lunch in the classroom. Instead of moving classrooms, teachers move and students sit still. Desks are farther apart. So all of these safety protocols go on top of that. And with that, with the already existing crisis, that sets the stage for the crisis to really explode when buildings reopen. And so we, that's why we wanted to have this conversation and have people thinking about it. So we've seen early signs of trouble already. You've seen situations of students being removed from their online learning, banned from Zoom or whatever their online platform is for a period of time for disciplinary reasons. You've seen students being muted, students having their cameras controlled, students being removed to breakout rooms, all in the remote setting, which are all what? Disciplinary removals, right? They are being removed or unable to fully access their educational environment. Then you're seeing even more concerning things. You're seeing online school dress codes being required. You're seeing school policies, safety policies that are meant to ensure, obviously, safety of other students in the building being applied in the virtual scenario. And an example of that is the case that you may have all heard of out in a city outside of New Orleans. A student fake BB gun on his floor. His brother tripped over it. He picked it up, put it on the desk, and was disciplined for that. And so you're seeing punitive attendance policies. So you're seeing all this in the virtual environment, which is not giving a lot of hope, right? That that when we get to the reentry, that things are going to be any better. So I want to pause for a second and see if we have anybody who has any other thoughts or ideas in the virtual setting, anything that they've heard of that we haven't heard of before, or that isn't listed here. You're welcome to put it in the chat, or I think you can unmute.
I would just add another concern we've heard is, monitoring what students are doing on their computers. And I think this has been an issue, surveillance of students, for a long time. But now when virtual education is the medium for instruction, there are concerns about laptop use and what students are doing while they're trying to access their education as well.
Yes, and I see Jennifer wrote virtual suspension rooms. Yeah, I think we've heard these, like removal to a breakout room that is like in school, like virtual in school suspension. Exactly. That's certainly a concern. Any others that anybody wants to share before we move on? All right. So we have highlighted, I guess is the right word, the crisis that was happening before COVID, the layers of COVID that have the opportunity to explode that. But we would really love for educators to think about this as an opportunity to rethink how they do discipline. And so, our suggestion is, and I think we'll Gabrielle, I don't know if we want to do that now, drop a link in the chat or make available a PDF of the white paper that Megan and I and our organizations, organizations did. But what we're recommending is 3 things: robust communication, collaborative planning, and then a commitment to a holistic approach. And we're going to talk through what these mean really quickly, and then we're going to move on into the policy environment that's happening at the federal level. So robust communication is, parents are partners to teachers in the, in the pre-COVID world, right? In an ideal setting, schools and families are working together and communicating well to better educate the student all students, but particularly for students with disabilities. In this COVID era, it is 1,000 times more important for families to be treated as partners from the schools. And so we are encouraging schools to reach out to parents to seek out information from them about what the experience has been for that family and particularly for that student during this period of time. Questions that that those educators want to ask. What has it been like? Were they able to access remote instruction during the spring? Have you been out in the community? If you have, has the student been able to socially distance? Have they been able to wear a mask? What has been successful? What has been a challenge? What's going on with your family? What can we do to support you? What sorts of things have you had to deal with as a family? And are there ways that we can help support that? And I think and Megan and I have talked about this, and Megan pointed this out to me when we were writing this paper. It's really important not only that educators do that, but that they're trained to do that, right? They have to have training in how to have those trauma-informed conversations with families. So it's not just something, everyone is really comfortable in doing. So we really want to make sure they're reaching out. And then the communication has to go the other way. The schools need to be able to tell the families what school is going to look like. So when your student returns, we're going to have lunch in the classroom. We're not going to be going into the full lunchroom with all the different classes, which may be a good thing for some students who can't handle the noise. Or we will have a mask requirement. There will be one asynchronous day and 4 days in the building. Whatever that new normal is, sharing that with the family ahead of time is really critical so that they can prepare for that and normalize for it. The second thing that we recommend is collaborative planning. Obviously, teachers are great planners, and this is just a really critical time to be planning ahead, to be thinking about what students' individual needs will be when they come into the building so that you can meet those needs before they get there. One example that I like to raise is if a student has sensory issues, so a mask, if the educator talks to the family and the family says, he's only been able to wear this mask for like 10 minutes and then he throws it and he is really upset and, it ruins his day and it sends everything into a spiral. Well, is there a way that the family and the teacher can come together and maybe say, hey, let's think about if a face shield would work, and let's get that to the student at home so they can try to plan and see how that works. That's just one example of ways to kind of plan ahead for those needs. That the people in your buildings who are experts at addressing behavior issues, school psychologists, the social workers, really elevating them and bringing their expertise, not just in the special ed setting where often they wind up spending a majority of their time, but in the full school setting so that they can address these issues all across the board. Functional behavior analyses, behavior intervention plans are critical. Were critical pre-COVID, making sure that they are used where needed here, and that need is probably going to be a lot larger than it was pre-COVID. And then finally, a holistic approach, asking schools to commit to not doing the things in those slides that we talked about, to not suspending, expelling, restraining. I mean, restraint at this point is actually a health hazard for the educator as well. So you're going to have to think about other ways, isolating, calling the police, but instead to committing to positive behavior supports, restorative justice, social emotional learning, and again, the training of the adults in the building who will be implementing those. I think everyone who is in the education world has seen restorative justice done poorly, social emotional learning done poorly, and it can be a complete disaster. And post-COVID, with all this other stuff, it's going to be an even bigger disaster. And so it's really important to make sure that that training piece is there, and that every adult in the building, again, not just the special educators, not just the person in charge of social emotional learning, but all of the people in the building are comfortable using these practices and making sure that that the culture in the building emphasizes them. So see, there's a question about whether there are questions. I'm going to pause there because I'm about to hand off to Megan, but if anyone has any questions, we would love to answer. All right, if not, Gabrielle, do we? Or okay.
Sorry, my camera was taking a minute there.
Hey, you're good.
I was going to add in terms of your communication point, I think that's where a lot of people are finding challenges during this time. And that's kind of where people are seeking most self-improvement, which can be really helpful as educators. Are there strategies, and you're welcome to pause on this if you're going to answer it throughout the slides, but are there best strategies for teachers to provide feedback directly to students that would develop more of that mutual respect in their classroom?
Megan, do you have any?
So, I mean, I think that it has to kind of start outside of the classroom as well. I think that family engagement is a big piece of this. And so COVID has really given us a chance to step back from just being educators and focusing on learning to really focusing on the whole family and their supports. Maybe you don't have to solve all of the problems, but if you can connect families to certain resources and really shape how families are getting through this time, that will go a long way to support students in their learning as well and building that trusting relationship with schools. So I don't know if there are evidence-based practices I would point to outside of what Wendy was talking about, social emotional learning or restorative practices, but just really looking, there are some resources out there on family engagement generally, and I would start there with just good communication and collaboration with families and building that relationship so that it can then translate more into the classroom as well.
Yeah, and yes, great points. And I would add, I mean, I think in professional development, having someone come in who's an expert in trauma-informed practices and doing professional development around trauma-informed practices, and then having the educators practice with each other on how to have these conversations. I mean, I could envision a situation where you have role playing, where, some of the educators pretend to be a parent that has gone through, certain traumas, and then having the educator work through that with them, I think would be really helpful. All not with me leading that, but with someone who's an expert in trauma-informed practices. And then I just want to reiterate what Megan said about the relationship piece being so critical. What we've seen across the country is the schools where relationships between educators and families of students with disabilities were strong and were prioritized before COVID are the places where you're seeing less problems, right? Those relationships and that trust was built up. And so there was a lot of grace given in these crazy times because they had that relationship. The places where relationships were not prioritized or they were challenged, and I'm not this isn't about blame, but where there were not strong relationships or where there have been real struggles and real push and pull, both for educating the students, but also for moving forward and, the finger pointing and all of that happens. And so schools that had prioritized it on the front end are a step ahead of everybody else, but it is never too late to build a trust relationship. And the way you do that is the way you do it in the real world too. You sincerely care, you reach out, and then when you make commitments, you follow up on the commitments, and then you build that relationship. But I think Megan's point about connecting people to resources that help support them is a really critical way to show them, not just saying you care, but showing that you care.
Absolutely. And I think that's a good point because to what you were mentioning about even in a role-playing situation, that would also enable teachers who may not have that experience to learn more of those cues of what it may look like if a student has experienced trauma of some kind and just identifying those. So that's a good point. And I know there was also a similar question kind of on the opposite end of what I just asked you that was in the chat. So it's more from the family's perspective. And they're asking if you have any recommendations of ways that the families themselves can initiate those conversations with schools. And for the families with the schools that might not be as proactive.
And on this one, I just want to mention NCLD has been working with lots of organizations in the civil rights space on intersectionality and social emotional learning, which I think is really what Wendy and I are talking about here, is what this means for students with disabilities and particularly students with disabilities who also come from low-income families or who are students of color. And we have a resource that we'll be putting out in the next few weeks that really addresses how families and schools can work together to promote social emotional learning. And I think that that is just one strategy to address the discipline crisis, right? It's not in and of itself the entire solution, but we will have a resource coming up that has a set of questions that parents can ask kind of proactively about how the school is going to be shaping the learning environment for students, how they're seeking to understand students' needs before they enter the school building again, things like that. So I'll be sure to share that with this network when it's ready.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I would say, like, the challenge here, which is why that resource is going to be a really great resource to have, is that families are often feel hesitant to reach out to schools if they don't have that relationship, because they feel the power dynamic that shouldn't exist, because they're equal members of the IEP team under the law, and there's all sorts of legal protections for them to have a meaningful role, but families feel often that they don't have that role. And so I think it's really hard for families to be willing to reach out. I mean, for families that are willing to reach out, I would say, I would reach out to obviously the educator or the school principal, and in an open way, just, not in an accusatory way, or in a, like, when am I going to get my compensatory way, even if you might be feeling that, but in a, like, we're concerned about the school year. What can we be doing on our end? Can we have a conversation? And remember, families can call an IEP meeting just like an educator can. They can say, I want a meeting, and have that meeting. But again, a lot of times families just either don't realize they have that power or feel intimidated not to do that.
That's a good point. Thank you both.
Sure. So I'm gonna, I think, turn it over to you, Megan.
Great.
You next.
So, there have been a lot of grassroots organizing efforts to address discipline disparities and school climate issues for decades. And a lot of community groups have recently had a lot of success removing police from schools and making really important systemic changes in their communities. And that work is more important than ever. So I would definitely encourage you to explore what's going on locally in your community or your state on the issues of discipline and school climate. Because here I'm going to focus really on the policy response at a federal or a national level, and I'm really covering a brief history of the most recent initiatives within the Department of Education and legislative proposals that have been surfacing in recent years or within this Congress. So stepping back to 2017, I'm kind of going to go chronologically here about how the Department of Education has dealt with discipline issues. And under the Obama administration, the Department of Education recognized that there were persistent racial disparities in what we call significant disproportionality. And this covers identification of students in special education, as well as their placement in an educational setting and discipline, which is why I'm bringing it up here. And so the Department of Education issued new rules in 2017 called the Equity and IDEA regulations, and part of them addressed discipline. And at the time, districts were tracking their rates of identification of students and discipline for students, but some of them were using formulas that really were designed in a way that would never result in it looking like the district had disparities by race. And so we weren't really getting a clear picture of where there were significant problems across the country. The calculation methods that they had been using were not consistent, and the Department of Ed didn't know where to step in or how to support those districts if the data wasn't actually showing the true picture. So these rules were set to take effect, and all schools had to follow them by July of 2018. And they set a standard methodology that states had to use to determine whether districts had significant racial and ethnic disparities in special education and in discipline practices for students with disabilities. And they were an attempt to really bring uniformity to how districts measure those things. And as we got closer to the 2018 implementation dates, even though advocates were really vocal about how important the regulations were, Secretary DeVos at the time disagreed and issued new rules that delayed these for being implemented for 2 more years. And then legal challenges arose. The Council of Parent Attorneys and Advocates sued the Department of Education, and a court determined that the regulations should in fact take effect immediately. So now, as of this year, July 1st, 2020, states and districts are required to begin using this standard methodology to determine which districts do have the biggest issues with racial disparities in special education and discipline. And then those districts will begin receiving resources and technical assistance to really support and address those disparities. So as you can imagine, these regulations rest largely on quality data collection, and they were supposed to take effect this year, and many states and districts were preparing to implement them, but the COVID pandemic began. So it's really, I don't think anyone knows exactly how that's going to play out or what kind of data we'll really begin to see, and how that might affect implementation of these regulations. So it's important that we continue to urge schools and districts to gather good data in light of our current situation, so that we can really implement these and continue with the enforcement as planned, so that we can address the disparities that we're seeing in districts across the country. And the Department of Education also has several federally funded resource centers that can be accessed to support schools and districts in their efforts related to discipline and school climate issues. Specifically, one of the ones that the Department of Education funds is the Center on Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports. That focuses entirely on providing resources for schools in implementing PBIS. It includes tools, resources, blueprints on topics such as PBIS, restraint and seclusion, bullying, mental health, social emotional supports, and more. I don't know specifically what they've produced about how to support students in a virtual setting, but they have been a go-to resource for many schools during this time as we're seeking to promote more positive policies in schools. And then the IRIS Center is focused more generally on improving outcomes for students with disabilities, but does include resources on evidence-based practices like what we've discussed here, behavior management, positive supports, and really is more of the professional development side of a TA center, so educators can go there to find training. And most recently, the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights put out guidance on masks. As Wendy was talking about, this is one of the topics that we think can really have an important impact on discipline and how these policies are affecting students with disabilities. And so this guidance suggests that requiring students to wear a face covering could prevent them from receiving a free, appropriate, and public education. So if you think about a student with a severe sensory issue, requiring a mask could pose a lot of challenges for that child. And so without flexibility in these policies, we might expect to see students with disabilities facing discipline for noncompliance at a higher rate than their peers. And so schools need to be sensitive that in these situations, enforcing a mandate about wearing masks could have implications for that student's FAPE and whether or not they're receiving FAPE. So OCR is really suggesting that school districts make modifications to their policies in order to ensure that students with disabilities don't face discrimination when it comes to these policies. Of course, all of this needs to be done in a way that maintains health and safety standards. So the devil is in the detail there to really see how schools and districts are able to balance those interests for students. And moving on to what Congress has done to address discipline disparities, school discipline, school climate have really become a huge priority for many members of Congress in recent months. I think that the national focus on racial justice has really ramped up what a lot of members of Congress are hoping to do within our schools. And again, this work has gone on for a very long time, but in the last few months, we've kind of seen a resurgence and new interest among certain members of Congress. So I want to highlight a couple of bills that have already been introduced this Congress, as well as some that we know are currently being developed with input from stakeholders. Representative Presley, who's from Massachusetts, has made it a focus of hers to address discipline, climate, and what she calls the school to confinement pipeline. So at the very end of 2019, she introduced a bill called the Ending Pushout Act, and that really focuses on addressing the disproportionate use of exclusionary discipline, so suspension and expulsion, against students of color. And while this bill isn't specific to students with disabilities, we know that in effect, it will have a big impact on students with disabilities given the rate of discipline that they experience, particularly if they are students of color as well. So the Ending Pushout Act would provide a grant program that would support states and schools who commit to banning these discriminatory discipline policies and improving school climate. If you were to receive one of these grants, you would be required to ban suspension and expulsion for students in grades pre-K through 5th grade, and also ban corporal punishment, seclusion, and restraint in schools as well. Instead, the grants could be used to encourage practices such as professional development on restorative practices, trauma-informed approaches, and then investing in school counselors, social workers, and mental health professionals. And really the incentive here is to shift our focus from criminalization or punishment of students to one that is more productive, focusing on getting them the right supports and services. It would also require the Office for Civil Rights at the Department of Education to administer the civil rights data collection. All of that great data that Wendy presented on came from the CRDC. And so it would require that collection to happen annually, and it would expand the types of data that we collect about students. So it would better inform advocates and folks in schools to really see what's going on across the country. And then a second bill that's been introduced this year is the Counseling Not Criminalization in Schools Act. This, again, was co-sponsored by Representative Presley in the House and supported by Senator Murphy in the Senate. It was introduced in July of this year, and its goal, similar to ending push-out, is to shift how the federal government invests in our schools. So it would prohibit the use of federal funds for maintaining or establishing any police presence in our schools, and instead require that federal monies be used for grant programs that could bring in more counselors, nurses, and mental health professionals into our schools. And then just last week, I have this on upcoming legislative efforts, but it was introduced last week, still waiting on a bill number for it. But on September 30th, the Protecting Our Students in Schools Act was introduced. This is a bill from Representatives McEachin and Bonamici in the House. And this bill would prohibit corporal punishment in any school that receives federal funding. So that essentially means in every public school, corporal punishment would not be a practice that would be allowed anymore. And it would provide funding to schools through a grant program to implement positive approaches to school climate, such as PBIS, restorative justice, trauma-informed practices, implicit bias training, among others. And another one I want to mention on this is the Keeping All Students Safe Act. So this bill has been introduced in every single Congress dating back to 2009 and has yet to be passed. So it gives you a sense of how slow the policy process is and why it's so important that we're at the same time seeking to improve practices in schools. But it was designed to address the harmful practices of restraint and seclusion. As Wendy mentioned through the data, these it really disproportionately affects students with disabilities. They make up the majority of students who experience restraint and seclusion. And so recognizing the serious physical injury that occurs, the trauma and even death that occurs through these practices, this bill would prohibit seclusion entirely and set minimum safety standards for when and how restraint is used in our schools. So really, restraint would be limited to only situations of imminent harm or threats of harm to others. And it has to be only when other options have already been exhausted. So it sets up a stronger system of how we monitor instances of restraint. I know Wendy was saying the data we have is only on those that are reported. And so this bill would really aim to have a better reporting system, better transparency and notice to families as well, so that we know when restraints are used, on which students and why, and so that we can really address the practices surrounding that. So champions in Congress are currently working to update this bill so that it can be introduced later this year and then really be ready for introduction in the next Congress in January as well. And then there are some other bills that are being developed with input from stakeholders, and these are really focused on restorative practices in schools. Senator Bennett and Senator Casey have both begun working on their bills and are taking feedback right now, and so we expect to see more from them later this year. But what's really important to recognize, I think, about all of these efforts, and as you can see, there are a lot of them and they've been going on for years. And while they're very needed and really worth supporting, they don't necessarily address the situation that we find ourselves in right now. They address school climate in a typical sense, so in a physical school building. And the discipline policies that they're trying to improve are suspensions and expulsions from a school building. And so the pandemic really has forced us to think differently about discipline. There are new situations we need to respond to, and we're really being challenged to consider how student behavior manifests in a virtual setting, and now also need to address how schools are implementing discipline in that virtual setting. We need to think about attendance policies, how to increase student engagement in positive ways. And so the status quo isn't really designed for us to do that, and these bills don't really get us there either. And policy moves slow, so it could take years for some of these bills to actually be passed and then implemented, and we need to do more to support our students now. So because of that, I think there's an important role for educators and school leaders to play, because educators are the ones who have the ability to make an immediate impact in their classrooms and their schools right now. And here's kind of a list of what educators and school leaders can do while the policy process is ongoing and while we're continuing to try to make systemic change. Educators and school leaders, I think right now in this virtual setting, can be working collaboratively across teams to really rethink discipline, examine the policies that exist in your school and district, think about what they mean in a virtual setting and how they would be applied in a virtual setting, and what that impact might be on certain groups of students who may be struggling right now or who may not have access that they need to school. And so you might want to think about behavior management and what discipline policies will look like as educators strive to manage behavior in a virtual setting. What happens if students aren't logging on to their virtual classes? Does the traditional discipline policy apply for truancy, or do we need to take a different kind of approach to get students to engage? And so rather than using attendance as a punitive measure, we really need to think about taking a positive approach to virtual learning, making it a welcoming environment and a responsive one as well. There really, I think, shouldn't be a need to use exclusionary discipline in a virtual setting. So rather than turning off a student's camera or cutting them off from instruction, we need to be thinking about how we create a positive environment in those virtual settings. We don't want to see the trends and the crisis that we've seen in the discipline setting transfer to this virtual learning environment as well. We have a chance to make a change and to invest in positive learning environments. We really need to work together so that we can do that. And you know, as Wendy had mentioned, the training and professional development piece is really important here. Educators can't just be expected to know these things. They've got to have the opportunity to learn how to do these and how to do them in an evidence-based way. And so districts either have or should be receiving additional funding through the CARES Act. I know in many states that money has not yet been distributed, even though the CARES Act passed late spring. So if there are stimulus funds still coming into your state or district, those funds can be used to provide professional development for educators in virtual settings, and that can include on the topics of discipline, on evidence-based practices that will increase student engagement, that will help increase family engagement as well. And so it's really important that we identify opportunities to do professional development around meeting students' behavioral, social, and emotional needs during this pandemic, because all of those are important to helping students learn. And finally, it's really important that we continue to collect quality data. If we want those equity and IDEA regulations to have an effect, good data is needed. So it's important, if you do play a role within your school or district on the data side, making sure that you have the right infrastructure in place and very clear policies about how to collect discipline data, particularly now in a virtual setting. We need quality reports and we need more information about what the practices are in this virtual setting. So just kind of some key takeaways before we open it up for more question and answer. You know, discipline was for students with disabilities was a crisis before COVID for decades. As far back as we have data, this has been a challenge, and it's not changing in the face of COVID-19. There is still a very high risk that students with disabilities will be disproportionately impacted by COVID, including in the way we handle discipline for them. And so schools, really right now is the time for schools to really rethink how they approach discipline and work on developing more positive environments for students. The ways to do that, as Wendy had talked about, are authentic communication with families, collaborative planning across departments, across teams within your school and district, and taking a holistic approach to how we serve students, and not just the academic needs of students, but their social emotional needs, their behavioral needs as well, and working with families throughout that. And finally, you know, while discipline and school climate issues have been a big priority, and we're continuing to push to support those things in the national policy conversation, there is still a need to be able to respond more quickly and apply what we know to virtual settings as well to prevent this crisis from deepening more than it has to. Wendy, anything else you'd add?
Yeah, and one thing I'll just say, when you talk about the need to collect the data, particularly now, I was in a conversation with some state level people trying to impress upon them that like disciplinary removals right now are happening in that virtual environment. And so when you mute a student's Zoom, or you turn off their camera, or you send them to a breakout room, who's collecting that data for that disciplinary removal? Because I don't think that's actually happening right now. I don't think there's been guidance. At least if there has been, I missed the guidance from the Federal Department of Ed on that. And so schools and districts really need to be thinking about collecting that data, because the time may come when they may be asked about it. And if they haven't been collecting it, they're going to be unable to provide it. So I guess we will go to if there are any additional questions.
And I think that so many of the points that you're making, I anticipate people who have been either participating in online learning themselves as students for years now, or are teachers of online learning, have navigated this. And maybe, if we have another session similar to this, we could have them in to share how they've been doing it. But I was going to share another common question that I hear from people is more relating to different age ranges and grades of students. Particularly with the bills you were just mentioning, Megan, is there any sort of delineation between bills that are more relevant for, say, your kindergarten, pre-K aged scholars who are participating in remote learning versus high school age?
Considerations in terms of the practices themselves. I would say by and large, social emotional learning and restorative practices can be implemented in curriculum across the age spans. I think that how you do it will differ by age, and there's a lot of research and information educators can find on how best to do that by age. But I think that the one bill that does have implications for certain age ranges is Representative Presley's push-out bill, which said it bans certain kinds of discipline for very young kids. And I think that's an important thing to think about. There are probably very few behavior issues that should warrant exclusionary discipline for a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old. And so I think it's just, my overall takeaway would be, it's really important that we think about age in the context of discipline. When we set expectations for student behavior, we expect younger kids to behave a little bit more unpredictably, to have challenges with emotional regulation, because that's just the nature of who young kids are at that stage in development. And so I do think it's important that we take the whole child approach to how we address discipline and behavior management in schools. It is important that we understand what's developmentally appropriate for students, particularly for students with disabilities, and use that to inform our approaches, whether we're talking about academics or behavior or emotional support. So the bills do address that in some instances, but I do think it's important that the professional development really dig deeply into that area to make sure educators are prepared.
And I would add that local policies and sometimes state policies are in place in different places. They're not uniform. They're not at the federal level, where districts have banned suspension, expulsion for students, second grade and under. I know some districts and some states have looked at things like that too. So you have policies here and there that also do that. And I think that's also a reflection, like Megan said, of the fact that students at that age do have that they have less ability to control their emotions. And then the other thing I wanted to point out that's related to that, it's not really age bans, but I think it's or grade bans, but I think it's important. CASA, the Keeping All Students Safe Act, which is the restraint and isolation law, right now with no federal umbrella law on restraint and isolation, you have some states with no law. You have some states with very, very strict laws, and some do have age rangers in them. And then you have some states that say every district has to create its own restraint and isolation. So you have this hodgepodge, and in places where you have numerous districts, for example, a state where charter schools are their own district, just as an example. So you might have 80 districts. If a child goes from one school to the other, that law, that policy is completely different. And so it's a really challenging thing for educators who need to know what they're allowed to do and what the parameters are, and for families to know, where schools stand on that, which is part of the reason I think that the Keeping All Students Safe Act keeps getting resubmitted.
That does make sense. I know here in New York, where I'm currently located, there are a lot of those charter schools like you mentioned. So it is, a big decision for the schools to make on that. Yeah. There was also another question added in the chat for you both. Are there states where, in quotes, promising practices protocols have been shared in absence of federal guidance?
So I wish I had states we could point to that have been doing a great job in this, and I'm sure that there are. I'm sure that there are some states and districts that have really, focused on eliminating zero tolerance policies and have made some important shifts. NCLD is actually in the process of looking for case studies and looking for examples of places where this whole child approach has been taken to really support students with disabilities. So I would be happy to report back as we continue to learn more. I don't have any examples of states off the top of my head, though. I don't know, Wendy, if you've seen or heard of others.
I have not. I can't name a state. I also, during the course of COVID, we have talked with a lot of districts and schools and charters about what they're doing and have learned from a lot of them about practices that they're doing that seem promising, but it's all very sort of sporadic and what you learn. There's certainly no leading state on this issue that I'm aware of. If they are, I hope they will contact us and let us know.
Always that opportunity for growth, which is great. And it will all be a trial and error, hopefully not too much trial, because It is a very high stakes situation in this case with students. So it's definitely important considerations.
Right. I mean, the hope is that this is such an inflection point and everyone is really just trying to figure out how to navigate it, that it really is an opportunity. I mean, like I said, you can't safely for yourself or the child at this point restrain a child, even if ideally you would not want to and there wouldn't be a policy for it. But even if you want to right now, there are safety concerns. So instead, why not figure out a better way moving forward so that even after COVID, you're not restraining children, That's the hope.
Absolutely. Great. Are there any other questions that anyone wanted to add to the chat?
We are both, I can go to that last slide so folks have our contact again. We are both, I don't want to speak for you, Megan, but I'm going to speak for you, both more than happy to respond if anybody has any thoughts later and want to reach out.
And we have the information for those that did sign on to receive more information from our speakers that we can share, of course, this resource with you. But also, if Megan does find any states, we can share those states with you and get you that information as soon as we have it. Awesome. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions added in the chat, but I did want to thank you both, Megan and Wendy, for sharing with us. This was incredibly informative, and seeing a lot of this information with a visual representation, I think, was very impactful as others were sharing in the chat. I know that even for me, it was. And so I'm excited to see what comes of this conversation and as states and federal guidance develops. So thank you both for joining us. And I hope everybody else has a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.